Ella.
Hi, I'm Terrence Regine. I'm the manager of 192 Books, and I'm here to introduce Glenn Ligon and James Hoff, who are here to discuss Glenn's new book, Distinguishing Piss from Rain, Writings and Interviews. They're going to have a conversation, and then there will be a Q&A afterwards. Thank you.
I also just want to add that if sometimes when conversations are going, it can be really nice if people chime in. So if you have a question or a comment during the conversation, feel free to just throw it out there, raise your hand, whatever. We can make this a larger conversation. You don't have to save it till the end.
This is like when we're watching movies together and James is intervening in the experience.
Wow. All right.
It stands. I'm learned to appreciate it though.
Wow, really setting the tone.
Okay. No, it's all love. We have questions for each other, though I confess that my questions were not as good as James's questions, but sometimes they overlapped.
We shared our questions. People are going to start leaving now.
Which I guess you're not supposed to do. Because...
Yeah, we've been told by a prominent podcast CEO that you're not supposed to share the questions ahead of time. We've broken the golden rule.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
You want me to start?
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess the question that I've gotten the most since we started working on this book, both since it's come out and before that even, was, oh my God, what's it like to work with your partner? So I guess I'll throw that out to you first.
Well, I guess for the remote audience, we should say James edited the book, and it is, I guess I wrote the things in the book, but James was the editor of the book, in case people didn't know that. Well, I guess, I was asked by the publishers who I wanted to edit the book, and I thought, well, James should edit the book for various reasons. He's got 20 years plus of experience through Primary Information, the press he co-founded, and I thought he would not annoy me in the way that other books that I've had annoying experiences. And I think it's because in some ways when I'm writing something, I just once it's done, I kind of don't want to think about it anymore. And when you're working on a book like this, you have to think about it all the time. And that I found that too much in a way. So you were a great choice for editor because I could just let you think about it all the time. And
I did feel like a proxy at certain points.
Oh, you were totally used as a proxy in some cases where we'll get to that. But also just the experience of knowing like what to ask for, what not to ask for, what's standard in publishing, what's not, when I'm freaking out about timelines and he was like, no, we're fine, that kind of thing was reassuring in the process. But also, I don't think I would be objective enough to assemble a book like this, And in fact, the earlier book of writings, Yourself in the World, which didn't really have an editor, I guess. It was put out by the Whitney and Yale University Press, and I don't think they really had editors.
I think Scott's named the editor of that book.
Well, Scott was the editor because Scott Rothkopf is director of the Whitney now, but at the time he was a curator at the Whitney, so he's curating my show, and he's the one that actually said, "Oh, why don't you've done all this writing, why don't we do a book of your writings and interviews?" But it was harder, hard enough to work on the show. I mean, I've said this publicly, so it won't come as any surprise, but, somebody asked me what it was like working with Scott on the show. I was like, oh, it's brain surgery without anesthesia. And it was kind of like that editing the book too, because I didn't really, sometimes you read interviews and you're just like, that's not any good. It's all stupid. Can I change it? Like things that I said, it's like, oh, can I just rewrite that all? And now I realize you can't rewrite it all. 'Cause, I guess.
Did Scott say no, or did you just didn't
Scott,
ask the question?
Yeah, I don't think he
or did the press say no?
Well, press didn't do anything except put their name on the back of the book and send it out. So we did it basically.
Yeah.
But I think Scott's a good editor. So there were some. I'm trying now. It's all coming back to me. There was one interview in the book that was originally published in French, and we got permission to put it in the book, but it needed to be translated, and the person that interviewed me did the translation, and it was nonsensical. So, we rewrote it basically because it literally didn't make any sense.
I should add that's not uncommon in the
It's not common. Okay.
in the
Good.
in the editorial
Good.
publishing world
Glad
to
that's
do
not
that.
common. Yeah. So I knew that James would take more care of the book than I was going to take, because it just was exhausting to me in a way. Going back through all this work that I've done, the 30 years maybe. The earliest essay is like 30 years ago. I was like, oh, can't go all the way back digging in those crates. I found it sort of mentally exhausting, so I'm glad that you did it. But also just the flow of essays in the book, what to keep and what to get rid of, what to add in, So I trusted you, basically, because of your experience.
And moments of frustration. Can you name one?
My version of this question, as I said, we wrote questions from the other. So he had this paragraph long question about this working together, and my version of it was, you have often managed book projects. How did you manage me? And I don't know. Did we have any fights about the book? I don't remember any.
No, it was actually pretty smooth on our end. I think there were lots of discussions that we had with the publisher, and there were other elements that we had to sort of work through, which you always have to do in this process. And I don't know, maybe for you as an artist, you don't have to do that as much, but as a publisher and as an editor, you're sort of used to working with designers and working with copy editors and other parties, proofreaders and things like this, in a way that you have to sort of be patient, and you have to maybe coax the situation to get certain outcomes. Like if you're not happy with something, you have to sort of play ball or be a little bit political in terms of how you ask or what you ask for and what you can get or not get. And
examples, please. Inquiring minds want to know. You don't have to.
Well, no, I think we I don't know. I don't know. I would say that, like, for the most part, working together was quite easy. I remember at one point, I think that there's, and speaking about the first book, which came out in 2011.
Yeah, I think so.
So that was Glenn's first book of collected writings. And as Glenn said, it was kind of brought together in an official/unofficial way. And you could kind of tell that it's a great book, but you can kind of tell that if you read it. I mean, it's not copy edited well, I have to say.
I don't think there was a copy editor.
I don't think there was a copy editor either.
Seriously, I don't think there was.
So that's like one of the things. It wasn't fact checked. Like little things that you might not notice as a reader, but make a big difference in how you experience a book. You would probably intuit certain things. So that's the kind of fine details that are really boring as an editor and as a publisher that you just have to do. They take a long time. And I think I remember at one point asking you, because for one example, I remember you getting really annoyed with me once and asking, is this what you do with yourself all day? Is this what you do all day? You ask these types of questions to artists?
Say that. Well, maybe I did, but not in that tone.
Because in I Remember the Revolution, there's a list where Glenn riffs on I guess Joe Brainerd, his I Remember publication, where he talks about things he remembers. And he says, I remember Trans Europe Express. And that went to a copy editor, and the copy editor came back with a query, which was, is Glenn talking about the album, or is he talking about the song? Because if it's
so annoying. Anyway,
if it's the album, it's formatted differently than if it's a song. So one goes in quotes and one goes in italics. And these are the things that are super boring in my life. And luckily, most of the world does not have to deal with. And luckily, Glenn does not have to deal with them, because they definitely annoyed him. But that was the question. So
yeah, well, the first book of writing the interview, there were no questions about Trans Europe Express and quotations and italics, and
that makes sense,
because there was no copy editor.
Yeah, exactly.
And yes, and Scott officially was the editor, but we were also working on an exhibition, together. So he had a lot on his plate, and a exhibition that had a catalog too. So we were actually getting 2 books out at the same time, which is a bit nuts.
So how long did it take you to put the first book together? Was that just done in like 6 months, like a year, or?
No, it was longer, a year. I think also because I think that Scott thought there was more writing than there actually was.
Well,
so in order to make our page count, we started looking at more interviews then. And some of the interviews, I don't know, early in my career, I was a good boy. So I would say yes to interviews that were basically just questions that I'd already answered in other interviews. And so when you gather them together in an anthology, they're kind of boring because they're the same questions, basically, just separated by years,
Yeah, I noticed that.
Okay. So how did you deal with that?
I think, with interviews in general, it's hard. I mean, you give a lot of interviews, so you're going to get asked a lot of the same questions. And I think it's hard. It's unique when an artist has the time to give an in-depth interview, and the person that's giving the interview is prepared to receive or give an in-depth interview or ask for an in-depth interview, because not everyone, we live in a world where not everyone has the time to probe deeply. And I think that actually, some of the earlier interviews that are in this book that are also in Yourself in the World are really great, because it was earlier in your career. I think you were less known. There was more discovery happening. You were younger, and there was a lot of other things happening around you, and there's a different context. And I think that people were trying to go deeper.
Well, partially, I think it's because some of those interviews were with artists.
Yeah.
Byron Kim, Stephen Andrews, friends of mine who were artists who would ask different questions than another kind of interviewer would ask. But also, I think I was learning as I was answering questions. I'm working on a show right now with a curator who was coming to a talk that I did. And I was like, oh, you've heard many talks. Why are you coming? She's like, you say something different every time you talk about your work. And I was like, well, that's because I don't know what my work is about. So sort of figuring it out as I talk in some ways. And I'm sort of joking, but sort of not in a way.
I mean, I think that's an interesting thing about artists in general. I remember speaking to Vito Acconci once, who I worked with a long time ago, like 20 years early in my sort of editorial publishing career. And I saw many of his lectures. We've probably all seen them, and they're all kind of the same, and he had a few lectures that he would give, but they would kind of all riff on the same things. And I asked him about that once, and he was like, history makes everything seem so neat and linear, but it really didn't work that way. It was really messy. But when you're looking back and you're putting it all into a slideshow, it looks really neat. And I think that that's true for a lot of artists, a lot of cultural producers, a lot of creative people. Like, people tend to sort of edit out, either self-edit or culture edit edits out the sort of messier parts
Mhm.
in favor of a linear narrative that's easily digested, easily understandable. And I think it was also interesting as I was going through and starting to sequence the interviews, I started thinking, I started sort of seeing references to work that I didn't actually know or that maybe only had heard about. And so part of the strategy with the interviews was to sequence them, so that there was not a lot of overlap between them, because we don't necessarily need that as a reader, but also to try to choose interviews that could showcase works that perhaps people didn't know quite as well, perhaps like showcase some of the works that got edited out or have been not forgotten, but just not paid close attention to. Because I think there's a lot of iconic works that you've made that people, of course, know, but in between there are other works. And part of the sort of motivation for me with the interviews was to try to find interviews where you're talking about these lesser known works so we could showcase those as
and
well.
that was sort of interesting because I kind of you don't get to talk about, the plaques that I made for a show in San Antonio that I put out in public spaces and were stolen in, one day. Like, so there was one interview where we talked about that, but never really talked about that work, and nobody's really ever seen it, outside of the people that stole it.
Where are they now? That's what I want to know.
Well, one of them is with an artist who,
Stole it?
yeah.
Okay.
I mean, you put them out in public places and they weren't like affixed permanently. So you just.
Do you want to name the artist?
No,
Okay.
I don't.
Well, I think with Q&As, you have to answer the questions. So if anyone wants to know later, please.
Well, anyway, you know who you are out there. We should talk about the title.
Yeah, I was immediately smitten with the title. We went back and forth on a few different titles, and I remember I was traveling and you were here, and I remember coming up with some titles that I thought could work that were taken from texts in the book and just to throw out some ideas. And I just heard no, like to 5 different suggestions. So I was like, okay. And then you just said, why don't we call it Distinguishing Piss from Rain? And I was like, yes. It was like an immediate yes. And then you said, of course you would say that. Of course you would have an immediate yes for that, which I still don't understand what that means, but
Well, I know what that means.
What drew you? I mean, I can say what draws me to the title, but I'm curious to know what drew you to that title.
Well, it's in an essay. There's an essay that I wrote about Thomas Hirschhorn's project up in the Bronx, the Gramsci Project. And I was sent as a reporter for Artforum to report on that project. And I was sent there because it just happened to be the place where I grew up, that housing project, forest houses in the Bronx. So in the essay, I talk about my mom sending me from the South Bronx to a private school on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and her saying, me saying like she would kind of, what was it? It's in the book, but I'm not remembering exactly. But basically, like the idea that she entrusted my teachers not to, like, steer me in the wrong direction, or, entrusted my ability to distinguish piss from rain. And that came from, I think, Al Sharpton used to say that, but a lot of people, Judge Judy, apparently. And I used to watch Judge Judy, so I must have heard her say it, but other people too. I mean, you did a little research on it.
Well, we were sort of, the title was sort of brought, the sort of history of the title was sort of emerged as we started working with it. And recently I had a friend who's an activist and academic, and she sort of said, oh, I was at this activist meeting and someone said, don't piss on my back and tell me it's raining. And she thought it was really funny because she knows the Judge Judy version, which is like, don't pee on my leg and tell me it's raining. And I had to say, like, no, there's like several versions. And something we've learned that there's several versions that goes back like to the 19th century or something like that. But
the difficulty also was there was a little pushback, like a little nervousness about the title. I was told by someone, I can't see your name next to the word piss on the cover of this book. To which I thought, you haven't read the first sentence of the first essay, which says, my Uncle Tassi said there are two kinds of niggers in the world, niggers and crazy niggers. That's literally the first sentence in the first essay in the book. It's like, so piss on the cover is the least of your worries. I mean, anyway. But I think everybody came around to the title, and we kind of primed the pump too. There were some strategic Instagram posts that where the title was announced, and there were so many like, "Oh, it's great! Love the title! Love the title!" And then everybody calmed down. This is before the book was published. Yeah.
Yeah, I think when you announced when Glenn first announced it on Instagram, there was a lot of fanfare for the title, and then all of a sudden the sort of pre-sales went up really high, and everyone was really happy. And then all of a sudden, the title was great, and it was always great for everyone. So
Yeah,
revisionist history.
we could put a sticker over it. I mean, over the word "piss," distinguishing black from sticker from rain. Anyway. Yeah.
But I think I mean as a publisher and as an editor, for me, I have to think about these things all the time. Like it was a great title that immediately grabbed me for a couple of different reasons. The first being that it's not a title you forget. Like it stands out. It's brash. It's a little bit naughty, but not really. It's a colloquialism. If you know that, you know that. So that kind of takes a little bit of the sting out of it, maybe. But I think also, so there's that. Like if you're just seeing it in a bookstore, I would pick that up immediately. And I think the other aspect of it is that it kind of is a great metaphor for a lot of the work that's in the book in terms of how you've maneuvered through the art world and the world at large. And I think that sort of like duality works really well in a title. And that's not something you often get as a publisher or as an editor. You might get a great title that doesn't fit the book, or you might get a bad title for a great book. They don't always line up. So when they do and you feel it and you know it, you just have to run with it. And that's sort of how I felt with this title.
It's funny that, now that I'm thinking about it, I did a whole exhibition of book covers that was done for a show at the Walker Art Museum. And it was really, I guess it started thinking about Baldwin's covers and his author photos, and fronts and backs of his books from the 50s and 60s. And many writers like Hilton Als talked about seeing Baldwin on the cover of books and sort of recognizing through that image that, oh, I can be a writer too. There's this person, James Baldwin on the cover of this book. And I remember for me, it was less about his image, but the graphics. So I remember seeing A Street Bookstore back in the day, in the window, a copy of The Fire Next Time. And it just, I think black cover with red kind of Gothic letters. I mean, sort of not Gothic, but like block letters on the front, and just being stunned by it, didn't know anything about James Baldwin. I was maybe 13, 14, in the village by myself. That's a whole other joke story. But the importance of that cover and the importance of images of black authors like Toni Morrison's image on the back of like Sula or something like that, and sort of thinking about you could write a whole cultural history just on representations of black people on book covers. So that was the show that I made. So it's funny when it came to this book, I was kind of like, I don't know what's going to be on, it was kind of didn't have great ideas, but maybe the title was the good idea. But in terms of the image on the cover, I realize now that this is a really beautiful cover image, the way the book feels and stuff. And so I'm glad that working with the designers the way you did, we've kind of pushed towards this. Yeah.
Yeah, I was sort of like, we need your picture. We need you on the cover. And Glenn was like, absolutely not. He's very shy.
It's
Sometimes.
true. Sometimes.
And he said, absolutely not. And we kept going through different ideas and it wasn't quite working, but we settled on, I guess we both got our way. We got his picture on the cover, but it's the back of his head, which is from a work from the 90s.
Well, that's the most interesting thing, that it's from a work to me. That was the kind of thing that made it okay for me. Yeah.
But yeah, so I think that for me, it was important. Early on in the primary information years, we published we did a facsimile edition of Avalanche magazine, and they were really keen, at least for there was 5 newspapers and 8 magazines, and the editors were really keen with that magazine when it was introduced into the world in the 70s about putting the sort of picture of artists on the cover. So there's really famous, the iconic sort of covers from that magazine. So there's like Yvonne Rainer, Robert Smithson, Bruce Nauman, go down the list, and they're just sort of like portraits on the cover. Except like I think there's a William Wegman, which is of the dog, but they really believe that like these new art forms and art, because art does live in a world that's a little bit outside of popular culture, that there should be a face on it and people should be able to connect it to a person. And I feel like that's something that felt really important to do with this book, especially because it is a collection that spans 30 years of writings and interviews. It is you. So it made sense, I think, in that way.
Were you looking at other collected writing books, like covers and things, thinking about that at all?
Yeah, there's all those sort of portable readers. Those all follow a similar format, but there's a lot of books of writings that have like portraits of artists or writers on them. A lot of them are older, I would say, but to me, that's like, I think it's important. It was important to sort of work with the designers and try to create something that felt iconic in a way, or could be iconic in terms of design, because design is really important. I do think that we should judge books by their covers. I know we're not supposed to, but we all do. If you're in a bookstore, you've got to have a reason to pick something up. You're here with all of your competition. So a book has to grab you. So that can be done through a title. It can be done through a design. It can be done through format. It can be done in all these different ways, but they all have to be integrated and work together. And it's not easy to make all of those link up or sync up. And I think we were able to sort of do that with this book, which makes me pretty happy. Time will tell, but I think that was the aim. And we were really lucky to work with Pacific, the designers, who were very patient with us as we went through many different drafts.
Well, I think I'm just thinking about it now, that if there's an overlap between kind of studio practice, and you can talk about your studio practice, and making a book, is I only know if things are good when I see them. So that's hard for a designer, because they have to keep showing me things, It's like, I guess I'm supposed to have an idea of like what I want, and I don't really know if I have an idea of what I want until I see what I want, But that's hard when you're on deadline. It costs money to do that, They've got a million other projects they're working on, They have ideas about what they think looks good, and I'm kind of like, not sure what's wrong with it, but I don't like it. So it's hard, You're clearer about that, I think.
Yeah, I think that's one thing you learn pretty quickly as a publisher, as an editor, is like how to talk to designers and how to work together with designers to try to get the book designed to a place that makes sense for both yourself, the artist, and the designers. Because you want the designers to be happy, you want the artists to be happy, you want to be happy, you want the book to do well in the world. Those are things that are very hard to sort of like achieve together. And I think, yeah, it's not always easy. I have to say, I have a theory that this isn't the case with this book, but a lot of designers used to be artists, and so they put a lot into designs that they do for artists, and that's sometimes why they fail so badly, because they become more about the designer's vision than the artist. I think as a designer, as a publisher, we're here to serve artists. We have to serve their vision, even if it's something, even if it's a cover that you don't like. I mean, as a publisher, I've published book covers I wouldn't necessarily choose, but they make sense for the work, and that's what the artist wanted. It's an artist book. It should be something that they feel good about. And I think.
You mean it's artist books, or you mean it's a book by the artist?
If it's an artist book,
right.
So if it's an artist book, so it's conceived of as an artwork in and of itself in book form,
okay.
which is different than this.
Sure.
As Prime Information, we publish artist books. We publish facsimiles of older artist books, which means we produce them all to spec using the same paper and hopefully the same printing techniques if we can do that if it's needed. But basically the idea is to fabricate the book and replicate the original book so that it looks exactly the same as it did, because it's a work of art. And so if we're producing a new artist book with an artist, they may want a cover that we know is not going to do well in the bookstore. And a classic example is we published a book called Do You Love Me by Lutz Bacher, who's an artist that I loved and who was also a friend. And she insisted, we went through a lot of different cover ideas, and she insisted on just a blank brown craft paper cover with an embossment of a little heart in the corner. And I had been working at Print and Matter for about 7 years at that point. And I was like, oh God, this is going to do horrible in the bookstore. Like it's a great, amazing book, but it's not going to like cause you to, people aren't going to grab it, And at this point, she was a known artist, but still a bit of a artist. I mean, I guess she still is, though she's more well-known, or her work is more well-known. But at the time I remember thinking like, oh, this is kind of, it's a great, I understand it works, it makes sense, but it's not great on the sort of like marketing level. And that's something that is important, unfortunately.
So that cover was the cover?
That was the cover, yeah.
Okay.
But
yeah.
It took about 10 years to sell through it. I think we sold the last few copies right after she passed away. So, but I would say that it worked because she had published a book right before that had a similar cover. And then every book she published after that had the same cover and the same paper. So there were 5 books, and they're canonical at this point, if you're interested in this sort of thing, I guess. And they're all the same. The only thing that changes really is the spine, the back cover, the text. But for the most part, they're all, if you look at them from the front, they all look the same or pretty much the same. And so that in and of itself became part of a larger project that worked really well. On the micro level, maybe not quite so much, but this was a book of interviews. I should add. This is a very Lutz thing to do. It was a book of interviews that she basically would ask people that she worked with that were in her life on video. It was a video. These are all videos originally, and she would just say, "Do you love me?" And then the assistant would say, "Yeah, of course." And she's like, "Why?" I'm like, why do you love me? And like, "Oh, I love you because of this." And she just kept asking these like Socratic these questions, and she just made people squirm. And they're incredible interviews, but they're really funny, slightly uncomfortable at times. So I think Lutz was very good at challenging the conventions of different formats. And this was one instance, the book's design, that she also did that. So it's something I have great respect for. And I also don't mind saying that it caused us a bit of a headache. At the time, it was one of our early books. So I think it probably cost like maybe 20 grand to produce or something, which was a lot of money for us. I mean, still a lot of money, but for a book, but it was a lot. And we're like, how are we going to recoup this money? But you don't go into publishing because you want to like break even, I have to say, or even make a profit. So we're a nonprofit, so we're, you know, we it's easier to lose money as a nonprofit, I guess.
Right. Yeah, I think, well, that's interesting. I'm surprised. I don't know why I'm surprised, but I'm surprised at your attentiveness to all the stuff around, you know, the book, like literally around the book, like the cover and stuff. But I mean, it makes sense to me. But it makes sense that you've been doing it for 20 years, so you know how books, you know, there's a reason why those books, you know, on the bookshelves up there are up there face front, you know, they have great covers. So it's interesting to hear that, because it's not only that, it was, you know, discussions with James about, you know, when should you post on Instagram and when will people see that? And, you know, if the book is selling out, where, you know, how quickly can it get back into stores? And we did an event at Cooper Union, and I was like, I don't want, you know, I don't want to do a book signing after it. And I can see you were like, you should, you know, I signed books, but I ran out that place in the minute that lecture was over. I was like, I was out the door.
And then a week later, you were like, there's a copy of my book selling for $250 on Amazon. Like, why is that? It's still available. And I was like, is it signed? And you looked and you're like, oh yeah, it's signed. So
yeah. Hello.
Yeah, but there's a whole, I think there's a whole mechanism, there's a whole sort of set of mechanisms behind the scenes that you don't necessarily see as a reader or as a public or as an artist even.
Well, yeah, I guess that's what I'm saying, is that of the other books that I published, I didn't have someone telling me like, here's what's really going on, you know, and that was super interesting, you know. And sometimes I didn't want to hear it, but, you know, but it was super interesting to hear it, you know, and respond to it sometimes. Like, okay, you know, I'm not gonna, after the Cooper event, I was like, I'm running out of here, but I did sign 150 books, you know, so there we go.
Yeah, I think it's a really, I mean, I think as someone who, you know, got started in this business working at Print and Matter, and we would host readings and we would have artists come in, and as someone who never really had money to afford artworks, I could afford artist books. And if I could talk to an artist in the sort of process of getting that book or about that book, that those things meant a lot to me, and they meant a lot to people that sort of came through the door there. And I think that's hard to see unless you've been on the other side of the counter. And we can get away from that, or we can lose sight of that sometimes. And I think it's really nice when artists are making themselves available to people for conversations such as this.
I've run out of my questions, or well, some of my questions were bad, so I don't dare read them.
Oh, I want to ask one thing that you keep saying, which is, I just have two questions. I don't know where we're at on time, but
15 minutes
until the Q&A.
No, I think we should do Q&A, but ask your questions. That's fine.
Okay. You often say, and anyone who's at the Cooper Union talk, or maybe have heard you talk otherwise, will say that I only write on assignment. I only write on assignment. And it's sort of like this idea that you're a journalist and that you don't ever just write. And I was wondering why that is, and what it would look like if you weren't writing on assignments. And
I think because I need the prompt and the deadline, and I decided to write on something because I want to know more about the topic. So as someone like I just wrote an essay on Jack Whitten, and I had to do a lot of research on this particular body of work, Black Monoliths, which was amazing. and it just allowed me to get, or required me, so allowed me, it required me to get deep in a way that I don't do normally. You know, even though I love Jack's work, it's like, I hadn't read his book, you know, Notes from the Woodshed. I hadn't read it all the way through. And I was like, let me read this all the way through now, because I want this essay to be, even though it's only, you know, 2,000 words, I want it to be full. So I really want to know what Jack is thinking at that time period when these paintings are being made. And that's not something I did on my own, you know. So maybe I need the prompt, somebody telling me like, okay, here's the deadline, here's the topic, you know, and you don't want to mess up and write something bad that you just live with that for the rest of your life. So yeah. But yeah, everything I've written has been because somebody asked me to write something. I don't know what I would write if it were just, I don't just write. Like, that was a funny thing, thinking I just did a talk in London around Jack Whitten's work, and we had his diaries, Note from the Woodshed. I was like, who is he writing for? You know, I don't get it. In certain way, I know like lots of people keep diaries, and I have kept diaries in the past, but it's always this sort of strange of like, who am I writing for exactly? I don't really know, you know? And Jack is funny because in his writings, he's very meticulous. So he's listing like, I use this acrylic, I use this, you know, he's like, but it's like, he's kind of listing for the future in a way, because he knows exactly how he made the paintings. So why is he writing it in his journal? And I realized, oh, he's writing it for someone like me, you know, 30, 40, 50 years from now, who's going to be reading this, you know, and trying to understand his practice. And this is at a moment, you know, in the 70s, I was reading for this talk in London. It's at the moment when, you know, half the diary is about like, he has no money. He's not selling work. Yeah. He has no money. He's like, oh, I got a carpenter job for, you know, Mrs. Barnett Newman. Literally that, you know? And I was like, that is amazing. But he's writing these meticulous journals, and his philosophy about artwork, he's listing his breakthroughs, listing the materials he's using in the paintings. And I found it very moving. And I realized like, oh, the journals are for someone like me, you know, they're for the future. They're like him creating his own discourse, you know? But yeah, why don't I write outside of assignment? Because when I was young, you know, in high school, I wrote short stories and things. And again, in a way, that was because there was a teacher I loved. So I was writing for him, basically, you know. And then I'd go to the Piers because he lived on Christopher Street.
Oh, this is the one you had the poetry classes.
Yeah, I had a
with
poetry
after
class
school.
on Christopher and Bleecker, and we go after school, only get out around 7, and I go down to the Piers after.
Well, tell us about the Piers.
They're wet, you know, they're out the water. I don't know, you know. Anyway, this is too much information for live streaming.
It is interesting to think that, so your first essay that's in the book, like Blacklight, it was sort of written for an assignment for something you thought was an assignment, but actually wasn't required of you.
Yes, I was asked to be a respondent to a panel. I don't even remember what the panel was about, a college art association, but I thought respondent meant I had to present something as well. So I wrote a paper on David Hammons, and that talk on David Hammons at the beginning of that panel got back to Scott Rothkopf, who was an editor at Artforum then. And he said, we'd like to publish this, but since you've already given it in this form, could it be expanded to talk about other artists? So assignment, that was my assignment then too. So all those other artists I talk about were at the prompting of the necessity to change it. So it wasn't exactly the same presentation I'd given a college art association. So, and that was the first thing, that was maybe not the first thing I've ever published, but the major thing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting because it's arguably like your most well-known work of writing, or maybe one of your most referenced works, I would say. But that came, I would say, 10, I mean, you would know better, but I guess like 12, a dozen or so years into your sort of career as a visible artist that you were showing. So I'm kind of curious, this will just be the last question, I guess, is just what it was like. Like, do you consider writing part of your practice? And if so, what was it like to have that dozen or so? What was it like to be an artist that wasn't writing before you started writing?
I used to think that all of these things are separate, writing, curating, making artwork. It was all separate. And then I remember being a visiting artist at the Art Institute of Chicago, and my friend Greg Bordowich was heading the program there, the summer low residency program. And I said that thing, it's like, oh, it's all separated out. And Greg's like, I teach, I make artworks, I do lectures. I consider it all the same thing. I was like, okay, my head's going to explode. And I took that to heart. And I think it's taken a couple of years for me to realize, like, I have a show that's up now in Cambridge at the Fitzwilliam Museum in the UK. And the most fun working on that show was the wall labels I wrote. I mean, there's my artwork is in it, but then there are interventions in their permanent collections. And so I feel like I'm moving towards the space where I realize like all these things are kind of a piece because they're as hard as each other. It's as hard to write like the Witten essay I just wrote, 2,000 words. It took me almost 8 months to write it, and it's hard.
Yeah.
So I feel like, okay, the amount of labor I'm putting into it is kind of the same amount of labor I'm putting in the studio making an artwork, or the same amount of labor I was putting into this curatorial project, So rather than think of them as all separate, it's better to think of them as all the same, because I don't feel like then I prioritize them or I'm resentful. Like I kind of finished this fucking essay. And it's taking me away from something.
Yeah.
And now I think like, no, it's actually pleasurable. I get as much pleasure out of doing it, and it's as hard, but I get as much pleasure out of like making something in the studio. So yeah, they've kind of merged.
And you would put the curatorial practice in there as well, or the work that you do.
Yeah, because it's all about kind of learning about stuff, and the curatorial stuff is interesting because you have to learn how to deal with institutions and rules and regulations that are sometimes unspoken, but are so naturalized within the space of the museum that they don't even see what's going on anymore. It's just part of the DNA of a place. Like, for instance, the show in Cambridge, which I loved working on, but there was one gallery that sort of, Renaissance masters. So there's a Titian and all sorts of things in there. And I just hung these drawings in between, over, below, next to all the existing hang of those Italian Renaissance paintings.
Your drawings.
My drawings,
Yep.
Sorry. My drawings. And I sent them a sketch, and my sketch came back in a cleaned up form, but everything had been moved so that it lined up better with the paintings that were already on the wall. And I thought, yes, it looks better. But the point is the awkwardness, the point is my drawings don't line up exactly. They're not like centered underneath that painting. They're off to the side or too far up on the wall. Like, that's the point. But I realized there is a kind of culture in museum that's like, no, we got to clean this up, and it was unconscious too, because nobody noticed.
Yeah.
But I had to send them pictures like, here's what I sent you, here's what you sent back. And like, oh, they were shocked, literally shocked. I was like, just
You
so
did
naturalized.
you gave him the side by side.
Yeah, I gave a side by side. Here's what I sent you. Here's what you sent me back, and they were like, "Oh, we didn't even notice." It's like, yes, exactly. That's the point. But but it was fascinating in a way, and I kind of like but as I said, like writing the wall labels for that show was the most fun for me. So I realized like, oh, that could be art too, I guess. Part of my art practice.
All right. So
Questions?
on that note, before and after. Okay, first question.
So you spoke about the Jack Whitten book, but as you guys were working on this, were there any artist writings books that were either touchstones or kryptonite?
Well, I should add that this book is sort of the size of it is based on the Jack Whitten book as well. So if you have the Jack Whitten Notes from the Woodshed book, it's the same dimensions. And so that was definitely a touchstone for us.
Same publisher. Too.
Same publisher as well. They like things to line up, publishers as well. So
yeah, so that I guess was a touchstone, but I don't feel like maybe you did, but I don't think I looked at any other books. I looked at books in general, but I didn't look specifically at books of writings by artists to see like, oh, what has been done? What should I do? But maybe you did that.
No, I looked more at like your past books actually. For me, it was about trying to create something that was different from anything else you had done before. And obviously, I looked a lot at your first book of writings and made decisions about what I didn't want to do and what I thought could be improved or expanded from that book or retained. And so yeah, in terms of other books of writings, there wasn't any for me necessarily, though. I think there's probably a lot on the unconscious side of my brain because of just having worked on so many. It's interesting because I'm trying to think of like a canonical book of writings by an artist. And it's like I can name books that people say are canonical books of writings by artists, but I don't know if I would agree with them. I think it's such a...
What are your not three, but
Okay.
is there like recommend or maybe like
I don't read the competition. I'm kidding, of course. Well, Jack Whitten's book is fantastic because it's a snapshot of like several moments in New York because he lived downtown for his studio was in Tribeca, Soho. So it's a sort of snapshot of that particular moment, 60s, 70s, 80s. Super interesting. And the dialogues that were going on. It was like shocking to me to realize how many, because I feel like Jack Whitten in some ways, or Mel Edwards or Joe Overstreet, a lot of the African-American painters they're not in these big books that anthologize, or sort of like the histories of those moments. They seem to be like more footnotey, but then when you read Jack Whitten's, it's like, oh yeah, I went to see this one, we went to this show, was in this, it's like, wait a minute, he was there too, but it's super interesting but other books of writings.
I really liked Nick Mouse's last book, which was published by After 8 Books in Paris, it's a really brilliant book. It just came out, I think, in the spring. And then a book, if I can shamelessly plug something I published, I really loved Lawrence Abu Hamdan's live audio essays book, which I worked with Lawrence on for about 2 years through the pandemic. And he's an artist I really admire, and we have kind of a shared history in some regards through music. And that book just feels like he was sort of trying to, he deals with all these very heavy subjects. If you know Lawrence's work, you know that already. He deals a lot with audio forensics around political situations. He's part of a group of artists that are like, forensic architecture. He's part of forensic architecture. So a group of artists that are using their artwork and their art to investigate contemporary situations. And in Lawrence's case, he's actually sort of using these interventions through his practice, and he's being called on to testify in international courts of law around civil rights and other things that are happening in the world. And he basically told me that he wanted to take these performances he had made that had all this sort of technology around them and just turn them into basically a book and go on a tour as though he were Spalding Gray. Like he wanted to do a Spalding Gray tour of the world for 2 years, like during COVID. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Okay. And so we went through all the performances, and they really do read like Spalding Gray. It's strange. If you strip all the technology away, you strip the performance away, and you just get down to the text, it's even though he's dealing with very heavy subjects, it's very legible and very readable in a way that's very entertaining as well, despite the fact that it's dealing with very heavy things.
Yeah.
So
that book was interesting because I don't know if I'd seen any of his performances before I read the book, but I felt the book captured the performances somehow, like beautifully. Even though the technological apparatus around his performances wasn't there, I didn't feel like I was missing anything somehow. And he's a beautiful writer too. So I read that book. That book.
Other questions? Oh, okay. Hold on a second.
You said that you need a prompt,
Mhm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
What about when you're in the studio?
Ooh, good question. Yeah, I kind of need a prompt there too. And sometimes artists like James give me the prompt. A good friend, Steven, who's like half the work I've done have come from things that he suggested that I hadn't thought about. I made these paintings based on children's coloring books, and I was trying to color them myself, like draw an image and color it in, and they were terrible because I didn't really color as a child. I copied things from magazines and comic books. So he said, oh, you should just give these drawings to kids and let them color in, then make your paintings. And I thought, that's it. That's how that came about. So sometimes it's other artists seeing what you're trying to do, what you think you're trying to do, or maybe suggesting what you should do, that have been super useful for me. And often in my practice, the mistake is productive. So I'll spend a lot of time trying to do something, and there'll be some big mistake, something. And then I realize like, oh, the mistake is better than the thing that I was trying to do. So I run with that. So the mistake becomes
Like the awkward placing of the drawing.
well, just kind of like I'm trying to make clean letters with oil paint and it doesn't work. But then I realize like, oh, actually messy letters are better than clean letters. And so that becomes the text paintings, so things like that. But I spent 6 months trying to make clean letters. I just, so yeah.
All right, I think we have a question back here.
Mhm.
So I'm wondering whether you have any comments on galleries and getting involved in books and publishing. So for example, this book is published by Hauser Wirth, and we have Paula Cooper's bookstore, obviously. So does that and she's right there. So does that help kind of?
She's got a mean dog, so be careful. Careful what you say.
Does it make it easier, or do you look at this differently?
Well, to be honest, the idea of doing this book came from Hauser. Like, it's not something that I went to them with. They came to me, and the initial idea was to republish the book that the Whitney had put out, but that was 11 years old, and there are other things that, seemed to not make sense to just put that back out into the world. So that, so the idea quickly turned to, doing a new book with, so they came to me with it. So I'm grateful for that, you know. But this book could have been with another publisher, I'm sure. It just would have been a very different kind of process, I think. I don't know.
I think it's a history that goes back a long ways, and I have a lot of thoughts about it, and I'll gladly tell you after the talk. So is that our time? All right.
All right.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you for coming.